Is the EU a declining superpower? To answer this, let's first look at the top 10 countries in the world with the highest economic output. China, the US, and India take the first 3 spots. But in terms of EU countries, there are only 2, Germany in 5th and France in 9th. The UK sits in 10th, but is no longer part of the EU. Now, if we forward the clock to 2050, things are projected to look very different. China stays in 1st. The US moves down to 3rd and is replaced by India. Japan moves down to 8th. Russia stays in 6th. Indonesia and Brazil move up significantly to 4th and 5th. Mexico enters the top 10 the first time in 7th. And Germany moves down 4 places to 9th, with the UK staying in 10th. And yes, France leaves the top 10 altogether. Things become even more apparent when we look at the actual numbers, as China, the number 1, will have a GDP that is almost 10 times as large as the German one. For me, this picture alone speaks volumes about the European continent and the importance of a union, as European countries alone cannot compete with China, India, and the United States. As a quick side note, for this video I am looking at gross domestic product at purchasing power parity, which means that I'm comparing a country's economic output while also taking into account price level differences between countries. Now let's take a look at the European Union and their share of world GDP. Only 30 years ago, in 1990, it was the world's largest at 21.2%, ahead of even the United States, whose share was 20.3%. This means that in 1990, more than 40%, almost half, of global GDP was from the EU and the US. But ever since, the EU has lost ground, with the US taking the number 1 spot in the early 90s, before China leapfrogged both of them by 2016. In the year 2021, China had a global GDP share of 18.6%, the US 15.7%, the EU 15%, and India 7%. If we look at projections for the next 30 years, things look even bleaker, with India's GDP projected to be larger than the EU by 2035 and larger than the US by 2045. Then by 2050, the EU share of GDP will have fallen to 9%, the US to 12%, and India's and China's GDP will have risen to 15% and 20% respectively. Of course, these are just predictions, but with the current growth rates, the general direction of change is clear. The EU is losing ground. Now, if we look back at our top 10 graph for 2050, the EU would slot into 4th, trailing the US by $8 trillion and China by $32 trillion. In other words, the Chinese economy will be 2.2 times the size of the EU economy. Today, the Chinese economy is only 1.26 times the size of the EU. So I think you get the idea. The gap between EU and the other global superpowers is growing. But why is this happening? I have identified 3 reasons, starting with the EU's declining working population. The EU has 447 million inhabitants, dominated by Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, which comprise 66% of the EU's total population. In terms of the EU's global competitors, the EU has the 3rd largest population, sitting behind China and India, but in front of the US and also Indonesia. By the year 2050, the EU's population is projected to gradually decrease to 421 million. This would still make the EU the 3rd most populous in the world, behind India and China, and slightly ahead of Nigeria and the US. But if you compare these numbers to 2020, you can see that most countries have a growing population. I mean, look at Nigeria. Their population will double over the next 30 years. And this trend will likely continue even further into the future, as by 2080 it is projected that only 1 in 25 people in the world will live in the EU. This is mainly due to very low fertility rates in the Union. For a population to replace itself in developed world countries, each woman needs to get 2.1 children on average. Generally, if fertility rate is higher than 2.1, then the population will increase. And obviously, if it's lower than 2.1, the population will decrease. Now look at these numbers for the EU. Not one country has a rate of 2.1 or higher. The highest fertility rate is in France at 1.83, and the lowest fertility rate is in Malta, where it is only 1.13. There is also a clear south and northern divide, as the rates in the south are significantly lower than in the north. The EU average is 1.5 births per woman, which means that a lot of immigration is required to offset the population decline. And this brings us to the second problem, which is EU's aging population. And the statistics here are quite alarming. In 2001, there were 3.9 people aged between 20 to 64 for every person that was 65 or older. In 2021, this number decreased to 2.8 people aged between 20 to 64 for every person that was 65 or older. And by 2080, this will worsen even further, with only 1.6 people aged between 20 to 64 for every person above 65. Now imagine the implication for pension funds, government revenue, healthcare, and social care. Ultimately, a low fertility rate and an aging population results in a smaller workforce, which is a strong indicator for a weaker economy. And this is the first reason why I believe growth in the EU is slowing down. So on to reason number 2. But before I do that, I would like to ask you for a massive favor. If you enjoy these bite-sized types of videos about the EU, please subscribe and like the video. If I hit my 20k subscriber milestone by the end of this year, it would make the hundreds of hours I invest in my channel worth it. Thank you so much. On to reason number 2, which I believe is a weak corporate European Union. McKinsey released a study of Europe's corporate performance versus US corporate performance from 2014 to 2019, based on a sample of 2,000 companies who each have a revenue of more than $1 billion. The results are staggering. Europe's companies were 20% less profitable, revenues grew 40% more slowly, and money spent on research and development was 40% less on average than in the US. Most of these differences are due to Europe's well-known weakness in tech. The EU used to be able to use their competitive advantage elsewhere, such as in chemicals, automotive, and fashion. But the problem is that the tech industry is creating technologies that are beneficial to every industry. For examples, technologies such as cloud computing, quantum computing, and applied AI can jeopardize the EU's position in nearly all sectors, including current strongholds such as automotive and luxury goods. On top of all that, the World Economic Forum estimated that 70% of the new value created in the whole economy over the next 10 years will be digitally enabled. This is great, but how many of the top 10 tech companies in the world are actually from the EU? Well, sadly, none. Instead, 7 of the top 10 are from the United States, and the other 3 are from Asia. To sum it up, McKinsey predicts that the EU could miss out on a value-added opportunity of $2 to $4 trillion per year by 2040. Now let's go on to reason number 3. The EU has consistently struggled to quickly recover from crises. For example, the financial crisis in 2008, where the US was much quicker to make fiscal decisions than the EU, which resulted in faster recovery. For instance, to this very day, Greece has not recovered to pre-2008 GDP levels. Reports show that 10 years after the crisis in 2018, the EU economic output as a whole was only 9% above pre-crisis levels, while in the US it was 15% above pre-crisis levels. There are of course many reasons for this, but I think one of the main ones is the EU's reluctance to opt for quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is where central banks purchase securities in an attempt to reduce interest rates, increase the supply of money, and drive more lending to consumers and businesses. Or in simpler words, printing money. By 2010, 1.5 years after the 2008 financial crisis, the US central bank had printed more than $2.1 trillion. During the same time frame, the EU central bank didn't print any money. Instead, the EU opted for austerity, which is a combination of spending cuts and tax increases. One only has to look at the rules imposed on Greece. In fact, the EU did not start with quantitative easing until 2015, which many argue is a big reason why it was slower to recover than the US. A second reason why the EU is slow to respond to crises is because member states have veto votes. It is hard and it takes time for EU members to agree on a common approach. One only has to look at how Mr. Orban is blocking certain EU-wide sanctions against Russia. The EU is facing many crises, such as the war in Ukraine, energy, supply chains, and global warming. For stronger growth, I believe Europe needs to be quicker and more ambitious when it comes to solving these problems. So here are the 3 reasons of why I think the EU is falling behind China and the US. But what can the EU actually do about these problems? Well, the European Union could expand their EU membership to Ukraine, Turkey, and the Balkan states, adding more than 130 million people to the bloc. Or the EU could move towards a European federation to allow for higher efficiency and quicker decision-making. Future videos will look into more potential solutions. So please subscribe if you're interested, and let me know in the comments what you think is holding back the EU growth and what can be done to stop it.